Kristi Scott is here, and she serves as the executive director of the Cascade County Historical Society and the History Museum of Great Falls. In the decade prior to her current position, she was an intern for the Ursulines Western Provincial Archives, and she also was a curatorial assistant at the C.M. Russell Museum and the curator of arts for the Paris Gibson Museum of Arts. Please join me in welcoming Kristi.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here today, and to the Montana Historical Society for offering an opportunity for me to share this body of research. I include the biographies in this work of 5 individual children who were away from home at off-reservation boarding schools located in what was to become Cascade County over the course of about a 17-year period. And each of these children attended institutions as a student, and these institutions were designed to acculturate them by separating them from their culture and essentially Americanizing them. Individual lives are important, and I believe there's an absence in the historical record that really warrants more scholarship, particularly so from Indian country. Several people in the audience today likely know way more than I do about anything that has to do with the boarding school experience. And I'm just here to share with you some of the history that I've dug up, and a lot of that has been through object-based research, and it shouldn't be overlooked. I use historic records. A lot of those are cited in books written by others, images from the National Archives, interviews with family members and newspapers, as well as BIA records that pertain to Fort Shaw that are stored in Denver. And then, of course, objects to illuminate some of the experiences of students who attended schools in Montana. Can everybody hear me okay, or should I talk even closer? Do you like it even louder? No? Okay. Side note, the place I work recently has retained the Ursuline Western Province records, and we have made a strong commitment to work with the tribes first before any of these records are opened up to the public. And none of the material in my research today comes from those records. I didn't think it would be fair at all, as the director, to get to poke through records before the TIPOs and people whose families went to the schools researched first. So anything that comes from the annals or an account came from either the Birdtail book that was written by Genevieve McBride, an Ursuline, in '74, or from Irene Mahoney, who was also a sister that wrote a book called Lady Blackrobes in the '90s. And then much of the other research came from time when I was had a short-term fellowship at the National Museum of Natural History, and of course the BIA records and newspapers, and then family members. So as a child, the only name I really knew associated with the boarding schools besides Richard Pratt would have been Jim Thorpe. I knew about Jim Thorpe. It was a celebrated story of a Sac Fox member who attended Carlisle, and his incredible athletic abilities gained him a lot of notoriety. In fact, in 1912, he received a gold medal in the Olympics. So he was a very celebrated student who went far, far from home to attend Carlisle. It was in the 90s when the Heard Museum came out with the exhibition Away from Home, American Indian Boarding School Stories, that my eyes really opened up, that this story was a lot bigger than anything I could have imagined. But still, it didn't really hit home. I imagined a few kids went away from their reservation schools to Carlisle. I didn't know much about Fort Shaw at the time. And yeah, so that was kind of how this began. And then over the years, pictures like this one of students dressed alike, a sea of young faces, you know, they just had a way of searing themselves into your memory and making you think more deeply about the boarding school experience. While I was working for the Ursuline Historical Association in early 2000, I was first an intern for Sister Frances Xavier, that was the archivist at the time. And I was trying to help her do things like put pictures into acid-free folders, get a better cataloging system. And then soon I was swooped up into grant writing to help repoint the brick on their building. But anyway, during my time there was a special program put on by Humanities Montana. And we were recognizing, or they were recognizing, humanities heroes. And among those recognized were William Marcus, Arlene Reichert, and George Horsecapture. These awards were given, and during Mr. Horsecapture's acceptance speech in the 1913 auditorium of the Ursuline Center right here in Great Falls, the floorboards squeaked, the building moaned. It was quite the experience, and I was really inspired by his direct and meaningful acceptance speech. Because the Ursuline Center itself is deeply embedded in Montana's boarding school story. This place served as a repository for records for the boarding schools, not only across the state of Montana, but also Idaho, Washington, California, and Alaska. These are some older pictures of George Horsecapture. I wish I would have taken more pictures that day, but I thought it was fun to show that, gosh, look, he was at the second annual Montana History Conference. So definitely a humanitarian and an advocate of the Anininaine tribe that he was a part of. So Mr. Horsecapture thanked the council for his award, and then he addressed his ancestor, Wathanetha. Wathanetha had lived and died with the Ursulines at St. Peter's Mission. Catholic nuns ran 74 Indian boarding schools, according to a recent report, and St. Peter's Mission was just one of those. Wathanetha was known as White Plume Woman by her people, and she actually died as a novitiate, which is a nun in training, at age 23. Mr. Horsecapture critiqued the nuns for not being more organized, though they had, as he said, at least 5 pickup loads of records. They couldn't find her burial place anywhere. And this is one of, their own that they had recruited to become a nun. So it was shocking to him, and I was inspired by his directness during his speech that, thank you for this award, but there is so much work to be done. Not knowing how she arrived there, there are accounts in both McBride and Mahoney's books that contend that she'd been at the mission since she was about 8 years old. And she started just 2 years after the Ursulines began their school there. They had joined the Jesuits that had been there, at least a decade prior. It's noted in the annals in the Birdtail book that on January 11th, 1893, it says, this evening, the dear Indian girls invited Mother and the nuns to the entertainment. Mary Wallace and Wathanetha played a duet, Petite Carousel, and Wathanetha played alone Bluebells of Scotland. We were amazed, as they had only been taking lessons since June. 20 days later, the annals wrote, we were suffering intense cold, short of wood. Thermometer in the shelter marked -39, and in Helena, it's -52. Wathanetha was brought along on what the nuns called a begging tour, and that was to garner more sisters to join their cause in the West, and of course to get more funding. She was just 15 years old at the time, and Sister Angela Lincoln, who was 30, accompanied them, as well as Mother Amadeus, who was the head of this group of Ursulines, and she was 50 at the time. And they went to Toledo, that was their first stop in Ohio, and then all the way on to Quebec City, where the headquarters were. I think I was just going to note also that Wathanetha was called Sister Immaculata by the sisters, and she was part of a small group of Native sisters that Amadeus had formed called the Virgins of the Sacred Heart. Oddly enough, they would take only 3 of the Ursuline vows, so not quite become a full Ursuline. And their specific mission was to proselytize amongst their own people. 5 young women joined this order between 1898 and 1901. I just would make note that 3 left while they were still novices. 1 died shortly after becoming a postulant. And then in 1901, after making her vows on her deathbed, Wathanisa passed away at age 23. The boarding school in Montana, it's a complex story and there's a lot to it. And I've never been able to find one account of all of the schools and the number of children who attended. And I put this slide up just to illustrate in Blackfeet country alone, here's a bunch of different schools that were operating simultaneously and recruiting all at the same time. So, a year after Watsanetha entered St. Peter's, the General Allotment Act of 1887 aimed to break up tribal lands. And then just 6 years later, 5 years later, in 1891, education for Native American children was compulsory. So no longer was it your choice, you were forced to put your child in a school. St. Peter's, too, would have been swept up in this policy movement that advocated and then demanded for the assimilation of Indian people into mainstream American society. This policy that once encouraged isolation through removal to reservations now favored forced acculturation. This is an image I put together during my master's thesis because I found this map and there were all these federal boarding schools and I wanted to see Fort Shaw on there. St. Peter's Mission, the only other off-reservation boarding school in Montana, was just a little bit, like 20 miles to the south of Fort Shaw. Let's see, I wanted to say that Carlisle began in 1879. It was the flagship school. It was a national model where it really emulated military barracks with exercises and strict regimes. And other schools followed Carlisle, including Montana's own Fort Shaw. I found something that in 1895, the annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, he states that though Montana has several large Indian agencies, the Indians in Montana do not like to send their children east. Here's a picture I found while I was in the National Archives of students at Fort Shaw. There's easily 100 children in this picture, and they sit on benches or pews before the photographer, perhaps gathered together for a special occasion. Stovepipes run the length of the high ceilings and down the wall to a large coal-burning stove in the back of the room. The overexposed background in the photograph looks stark, and there's few pictures visible on the wall. While the older students in the back rows sit perfectly still for the photographer, the foreground reveals the fidgeting movement of younger children in the blurred images. As Creek anthropologist Tansina Lomawea contends, boarding schools were and are defining experiences for American Indian people. A multitude of outcomes resulted from this educational experiment with Native American children that continue to plague Indian schools today. A resulting chasm from the schools separated individuals from their childhoods and leaves a gap where family and tribal histories have been disenfranchised from successive generations of American Indian people. In much of my research, I focus on object-based research, and I explore how museum collections can serve as windows into America's social history, and in this case, into the boarding school story. Here specifically, I look at the life of Charlie Mitchell, who was a Lakota boy from Fort Peck, and he had not one, but 2 carvings in the National Museum at the Smithsonian. And Charlie Mitchell came to Fort Shaw with his siblings again, far from his home in Northeast Montana, when their agency school burned down. And they arrived by train in 1892, some of the very first students. Here's an image of woodworking class at Fort Shaw. This was also in the National Archives, and not challenging to make an association that those stacks of wood may be what was used to carve the blocks. And here you see these young boys working with lathes and carving tools. Perhaps Charlie is in this picture. According to the records I researched at the BIA, Charlie arrived when he was just 6 years old. He left the school almost 7 years later in 1899, and he was in the wood shop for 2 full years, beginning at age 8. He also had an older sister named Sarah Mitchell, who played on the famed Fort Shaw girls basketball team. Interestingly enough, the BIA records actually show that he left the school, but then re-entered almost a year later. So maybe he wanted to finish some educational opportunities. I'm not sure why he came back when he was 17, but he did. Here's a catalog record that came with the woodblocks. They were donated in 1938 by the widow of General Hawley. And from what I could tell, Hawley was traveling around and visiting the Indian schools and then taking examples of fully acculturated work back to Washington, D.C. I thought it was especially interesting that these initials, JCE, look familiar. John Ewers, he was the first curator at the Museum of the Plains Indian in Browning back in the 30s. So he would have been familiar, I think, with some of these names, and certainly with the school, to the point where he crosses out agency and adds Fort Shaw. Another student I'd like to highlight is Mary Johnson. She attended Fort Shaw and also had a sister on the famous girls basketball team. In fact, her sister Belle was the team captain. Mary was the oldest, and they have many descendants in Indian country today. Mary Johnson was born near Belt, Montana in 1880, and like many kids who attended Fort Shaw, she was of mixed heritage. Mary's German father, Charles Johnson, was a rancher in Kibbe Canyon, just south of Fort Benton, and he met her Blackfoot mother, Jenny Nearly Died, at the Piegan encampment nearby. I learned through interviews with descendants of Mary's that her dad, Charles, died when some logs rolled atop him while building the family home. Mary's mother moved the family home to the Blackfoot Reservation. She had 6 children, and she began school at Willow Creek. Her artwork features a low relief floral carving with daisy-like foliage reaching towards either diagonal corner of this once flat surface. There's 7 veined alternating leaves that line the stem with 2 abstract bud-like designs above and below the double-stemmed flower. A smooth border outlines the composition, and an evenly stamped background adds dimension to the carving. The creative leisure in the abstract design indicates freehand drawing and genuine planning and design by the individual artisan. And I would argue that instead of completely acculturated work, that perhaps this was imagery Mary may have been familiar with. I wanted to point out that after her time at Fort Shaw, I learned through her family members, Mary and Nora Lucan, that she actually worked at Fort Shaw. Here's some records from the BIA from the National Archives that the family found, showing that she entered the school or was working at the school in 1904 and 1905. I've highlighted 2 names because her husband, Edward Gobert, also worked at the school. And they were so successful as teachers that they were brought to Atlanta to a national conference to showcase their skills. And as mentioned, she was hired first as an assistant at the school and then promoted to the assistant matron. She married Edward Rock Gobert, a fellow student turned instructor, and the school was dear enough to them that they married there on Christmas Day in 1900. That same year, when Mary was 20 years old and her youngest sister Ida was just 10, their mother Jenny died. And again, all of that was gathered from correspondence and personal collections from the family. The illumination of these carvings as something that can inform our knowledge about the boarding school experience bring new meaning to pictures like this. I had seen this picture over and over again in the Cascade County album. It's an image that's at the Montana Historical Society. And I mean, I probably saw it 5 years before I saw the wood carvings. And I think the carvings are much better understood and the pictures much better understood when paired together. Here's another picture from the National Archives. Perhaps Mary's husband Robert is featured in this image, or the young Charlie Mitchell. This is the saddle shop at Fort Shaw. Unfortunately, there aren't names attached to the image. Next, I wanted to talk about Emma Wells, who started school at St. Peter's in 1884. This was the year the nuns arrived, and 2 years before Watsanetha came to St. Peter's. Her father was an Irish immigrant named James Wells, and he actually was a business partner of T.C. Powers and managed Fort Claggett, which was previously Camp Cook, that was established in 1866 on the Judith River. He married and had children with Morning Star Horse Capture and a Neenaneen woman who was baptized Margaret Wells. When Mr. Wells became ill in 1885 and died, their 3 kids were placed under the guardianship of T.C. Powers, even though their mom was still alive. Here's some of the annals from the time that Emma attended St. Peter's. And again, I got these out of a book. And you can read through them. Most interesting I find is the second one where it says, Le Frambois came from Assiniboine, which I'm assuming is Fort Belknap, for their girls. They were persuaded to leave them until the end of the year. The very next day, the annals report Le Frambois came back and he took his girls. But within that same entry, you have Mr. Trudeau of Shodo, who brought his children that had a Blackfeet mother and just ages 6 and 8, Lucy and Nellie, to the school. That year, there were 180 children at St. Peter's. This is an artwork that was created by Emma when she was just 12 years old. She'd actually been at St. Peter's for 8 years by this time, and it now resides at MHS, along with several religious cards and a rosary that she carried with her throughout her life. And when she passed away, it was donated by her children. And I love that there's a publication where historian Laura Ferguson says, whether this scene was derived from memories of her father's trading post or solely from her imagination will not be known. I do believe you could see the Judith Mountains in the background from where the fort was, but I've also heard folks say that perhaps the lady up front with the bundle of sticks on her back, maybe that's Mary Fields. Also, there's a quilt created by her sister Mary, who was in the earlier picture that I showed of her. And I just wanted to note that their mother, Morning Star Horse Capture, died in Milk River Country in 1895. Likely during the decade her children were away at school. Of course, gendered training was emphasized while the children were away at boarding schools, but there are some physical examples that defied my own expectations, including this next carving. While most of the woodblocks depicted floral and floral-like designs, this one, made by Assiniboine student Louisa Worth, stands out as a geometric design of an 8-pointed star. Each of the 8 points of the star are beveled and reach equal distance from the middle of the design. Decorative corners with cutout frames frame the star's rays. And they're all accommodated with perfectly carved interiors. The multi-pointed star appears to rise out of the center of the woodblock with an intricate addition of a smaller yet similar figure within the larger star design. The perfectly proportioned and well-balanced design sets in the center of Louisa's composition. The Assiniboine and Lakota Sioux of eastern Montana are well known for their star quilts that Louisa Worth's carving resembles. Historically, geometric designs of circles, diamonds, and triangles were painted on buffalo hides, sometimes referred to as the morning star. When the buffalo were gone, women began to design and make quilts that replaced the hides. A design of a Star of David appeared on the blackboard in one of the pictures that I found from Carlisle, but it is quite different than the Morning Star 8-pointed design. Research suggests additional connections between the Lakota Morning Star and missionary quilting patterns do exist, but no one can deny that this design serves as a cultural symbol in Indian country today for special occasions like a birth, graduation, or death. This design might assert both cultural identity and resistance of Louisa Worth, likely, though she had some understanding of her heritage. She, after all, was the granddaughter of an Assiniboine leader of the Red Bottom Band, Wolfgot's Tale. And as I learned from an interview with the descendant, I learned that information from an interview with the descendant. And obviously, she was a very talented artist. While corresponding with that same descendant, R.D. Cecil, who I worked with this summer to do a very small portion of the coordination for the 125th anniversary of the Fort Shaw girls basketball team, she shared this sad story with me, that Louisa actually was murdered by her husband. Regardless of the sad ending to that last story, that 8-pointed star sits on the shelves in the dark at the Smithsonian repositories. It's not on display. I don't know that it's ever been displayed, and I think it's something worthy of bringing back to Montana, where the descendants it would matter most to could experience it, and the rest of us could admire the talent of this child. I hope that this presentation reminds us to think of not only this painful chapter in American history, but of the many people who survived and those that didn't. These children were no doubt homesick, isolated, and forced to figure out a way to survive in a very difficult time and in a very different place. This picture has new meaning after learning about Charlie, and certainly Mary and Louisa. And in my last slide, this has nothing to do with the individual people, but this image has always just really stuck with me from Lakota country, where you see that when the schools were far away, sometimes the parents moved to the outskirts of the schools just to be near their children.
Thank you, Kristi.